Welcome to Diplomatic Changemakers off the record, where diplomacy gets real. I'm your host, Wiola, bringing you unfiltered stories from top diplomats and global changemakers. If you're driven to make an impact, this is your front row seat. In this episode, we sit down with someone who's not just shaping global diplomacy, she's redefining it. Meet Fabienne Hara, a powerhouse of strategic leadership, conflict resolution, and international advocacy. If there is a crisis zone or a high-stakes negotiation table, chances are Fabienne has been there, making a difference. As the Deputy Director General of the Paris Peace Forum, Fabienne works tirelessly to foster global cooperation and stability. But that's just the tip of the iceberg of her 30-year career. From her groundbreaking field research in 10 conflict zones in Africa to her influential roles at the International Crisis Group, the United Nations Department of Political Affairs and Peacekeeping Operations, the Bill and Melinda Gates, and the Open Society Foundations, she's been a driving force for peace and security worldwide. Her expertise spans everything from conflict prevention to global goods diplomacy, and she's done it all with vision and grit. But Fabienne isn't just the behind-the-scenes strategist. She's also a brilliant educator and speaker. She taught at Sciences Po, where she was my professor during a course on preventing diplomacy and multicultural conflict management in Africa, and this is how we met. She also taught at Harvard Kennedy School and other top institutions, sharing her real-world insights with future leaders. Her ability to blend on-the-ground experience with strategic foresight make her one of the most compelling voices on the global stage today. In this conversation, we focus on Fabienne's remarkable journey from working in conflict zones in Sudan, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo to shaping policies that impact the entire world. Get ready for an inspiring, eye-opening discussion with a top diplomatic changemaker in peace and diplomacy, off the record, especially for us today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words.
Absolutely. Can you tell us a little bit on how you got into international organizations and into conflict? Because you started studying literature and languages. You did German and French. Can you tell us how you transitioned from that into working on conflict and going straight from that to Burundi?
I studied literature and languages, as you said, but I've always been interested in politics. The last year at the university, I was doing German studies. I spent a year in Germany, and this was the year just after reunification of the two Germanys. And so I was based in Western Germany, Heidelberg, but I traveled a lot to Leipzig, Berlin, and other places in Eastern Germany. And my thesis was on the reunification process. So 1989 for me, the fall of the Berlin Wall, was a really important moment in my life, an eye-opener, the beginning of my political thinking, I would say, and awareness. Then I got into Sciences Po after that, and I started studying international relations and global politics, and I kept on studying. I started the PhD program, and I was fortunate enough to have a couple of professors that really accentuated my interest in international relations. One was Ronnie Broman, who was just the outgoing president of Doctors Without Borders. And the other one was Hassan Salameh, who used to be a former Lebanese minister for culture, but also very much a part of the peace process between Syria and Lebanon, leading to the Taif Accord. And he was our professor in international security. Those two courses really interested me. Ronnie Broman in particular said one thing one time in one of his classes. He said, humanitarian aid or the humanitarian world is a way for young people, for interested young people, committed young people to have a real life experience. There are not so many places, so many fields where you can actually have a real hands-on life experience, not just professional experience, but also life experience. And I was very, very attracted to this. Previously, I had done an internship at the French mission to the UN in Geneva and at Doctors Without Borders International Secretariat. So that's the reason why I decided to actually move to either Doctors of the World or Doctors Without Borders or a humanitarian organization and have like a real experience of that field. And I also did my thesis on UNHCR, so on the refugee issue, like the pre-PhD thesis. So all of this combined made me actually apply to a position in humanitarian organization, and I got one, and that one was in Burundi.
So actually, through being interested in languages and literature, you got interested in the real life situation that was right across the border from France, which, by the way, I was born in 93. So my parents grew up in communist times in Poland. And that was also a very big, obviously, for our history, that process of reunification. And it's so interesting to see that you have seen that. And that is something that inspired you to take that experience and to take it into some of the other places in the world that were not yet reunified or still were in conflict zones. And then you managed to match that with your academic interest as well. But then you must have been studying for a long time.
For about 7 years, I got a first master's degree, a Franco sort of German master's degree in 1991. And then I got into Sciences Po, and there was a competitive exam to take, but then I got directly into the second year of Sciences Po. And then I kept focusing more and more on international relations. And so I decided to start a PhD cycle. But then this opportunity came to go to the field, with humanitarian organizations. And I decided that it was time to do this. So I stopped the progress in my PhD and I said, let me get a real life experience instead of keeping on studying. I was very fortunate to do this. But the experience was very intense. It was exactly what I was looking for, I think, but very intense and dangerous too, because it was the middle of the civil war in Burundi. And all the humanitarian organizations were sort of frozen a little bit because it was difficult to move inside the country. There were many war zones inside the country, many security challenges. And we didn't really have authorization to go to, for example, the north of Burundi, where some of our programs were. So we had to adapt to a very complicated and very challenging situation. And I learned a lot from this. It was a time of civil war in Burundi. There was ethnic cleansing campaign going on. There was the post-genocide in Rwanda with so many refugees in Eastern Congo. So our organization was working in Burundi and Eastern Congo and Rwanda. So we had a regional approach, but it was a very, very, very complicated time.
I can imagine.
Very, very dangerous time.
Especially for someone who has just come from finishing studies to being a team leader for a team in such a context for so many people. It's crazy to see that that's the transition.
It was not exactly planned like that. I was basically appointed as the administrator of the mission in Burundi. And then because the situation was so complicated, I started reporting more regularly on political and security developments and looking into the program in Congo and going to Rwanda to meet with the other colleagues. And so de facto, I became sort of the head of mission in Burundi, but also because of the sort of need to readjust our strategy, And so it was not exactly planned that I would take that job, but then I just filled the gap, I think. I started also challenging the organization headquarters a little bit about their strategies. And so anyway, that's what happened. It just happened.
So you took the initiative, and given the evolving situation in the field, you were able to move and to take on some of the new projects and to bring more people to be working on the new strategy that you have set up as you saw the situation evolving in collaboration with other people from Rwanda and some of the other countries in the region.
Because we had resources to spend on humanitarian program in hospitals and refugee camps and so on. But some of these programs had to be frozen for a while. And so we had these resources and then we had to spend them. We had to help people. But we were not able to carry on with some of the activities on the ground. So we had to basically reinvent a strategy. And we did it collectively, of course. I was not the only one. There were doctors and medical coordinator was there. The regional coordinator was there. But I just had to take, some leadership, essentially. And because it was a very unstable and complex situation, it just, as I said, I just filled the gap. And that's how it happened.
What would you say to people who want to work on conflict resolution or on building peace, especially in zones that are extremely dangerous? I have been in a situation myself where I have romanticized quite a lot working in conflict zones, because it is true that the work is so important, so transformational. You're in the center of everything that's going on. But at the same time, what is your take on what's the real behind the scenes of working in conflict zones? And if you had any messages to people who want to do that and want to follow your steps?
I think I have two messages and maybe a warning as well. There's nothing replaces a field experience. That's my conviction. I think particularly in international relations, if you don't go to the field, if you don't talk to people who are actually affected by the conflict and potentially part of a peace process, or that have needs and a voice in these processes, then there is no point in studying international relations, and particularly in conflict zones where you have so many actors and so many grievances and so many needs. You have to go listen to these people, otherwise your work is not relevant. So I think it's really important to actually do that and have that kind of experience. And for many, many years, because I transitioned out of humanitarian aid to conflict analysis and conflict prevention, the whole sort of conflict prevention resolution field that expanded a lot also in the 90s and the year 2000s. A lot of times I was thinking of myself as a translator, translator of the local ways of thinking about the conflict to decision makers, translating this needs into analysis, into like a set of policy suggestions, recommendations, to discuss with the Security Council or the EU Council or the African Union or whoever had the power to make decisions that would affect the dynamics of the conflict. But there was a need for sort of intermediary people or organizations that would actually help mediate between the realities on the ground and the actual decision-making process. So very important to go to the field, but a big warning also that it is actually dangerous. It's actually dangerous. One of my interns, when I was based in New York, went to Afghanistan and she lost her life because there was some sort of random bombing in a restaurant and she died. And so it's important to measure the risks of going to the field, particularly to conflict zone, and to make sure that you have a lot of safety guards, that you have the right security briefings, that you have the right contacts, that you have the right advice before you do this, because it is actually very, very dangerous. But at the same time, I think I knew about the risks. When I got there, I realized how risky it was. But in the Great Lakes region of Africa, and I think it's the same for the Horn of Africa, it's the same for Afghanistan. People who've gone to Afghanistan, they've become also very, very involved and very, very attached to the country. You put like a little finger in it, and then it's so complicated and it's so interesting at the same time. And the needs are so great, and it's intellectually very difficult to understand. It takes time. And from a human point of view, it's also really challenging and really stimulating, and you really want to be useful. The more you know about these conflicts, the more useful you want to become. But then you put a finger in it, and then you end up, putting your arms in it. And then
your whole career 30 years later.
Exactly. And then your head and your heart goes into it. It's very difficult to leave once you're in it. And I spent at least 10 years, working and studying and thinking about the Great Lakes, with Burundi or Congo or Rwanda, about the mechanics of violence, about what people, have in mind when they get into conflict, when they actually start to fight. Why are they fighting? What kind of mindset do they have when they decide to go and fight? And also, how do you fix very, very difficult processes? How do you fix peace processes when mass crimes have been committed? And this was the case. Very, very high level of violence in DRC, in Rwanda, in Burundi. When the polarization is so great, when there's so much fragility also. I'm thinking particularly about the DRC, and then later on about, South Sudan, for example, in the Horn of Africa. The fragility of a country like Congo makes it very difficult to actually find the right entry point into a peace process. And they are different region to region.
Yes.
You have the national dimension. What country does Congo want to become, right? And then you have the regional dimension with all the greed and the appetite, of the neighbors, particularly from the eastern side, Rwanda, Uganda, and others. Everyone got interested into Congo, yes, on the continent of Africa, and then internationally because of the resources. So much resources in Congo. So it's a very multi-dimensional, sort of complex conflict formation. It's intellectually challenging to find the right entry point into setting the right path to peace. And it's humanly very engaging. So it's actually very, very difficult to leave. And I had a really hard time moving on to another topic, actually, from the Great Lakes. I'm glad I did, because the Horn of Africa or West Africa or Southern Africa at the time, and then later on, when I moved to New York, all the topics basically on the agenda of the Security Council, everything was really interesting. All the topics are really interesting. But it's a sense, it becomes not just a job, it's a cause, it's a commitment. And it's both a professional and a personal commitment. It becomes like an adventure, right? And it's extremely engaging, and sometimes it's too much. Sometimes it can become too much because the violence is too much, because you feel like you have the world on your shoulders. You have to produce new recommendations, new strategies for peace in such an environment. It's not easy. It's not easy. So sometimes it can become a little bit overwhelming.
So to summarize, work experience in the field is absolutely essential, but also realizing how dangerous the fieldwork is and being able to be prepared for that. I do have a story around it, because I got a position at the UN peacekeeping mission to Central African Republic as a political officer. I ended up resigning from it because I felt at the time that I wasn't briefed and prepared enough to go. It was in a small office in Obo, which is next to South Sudan and the DRC. So it's a very complex situation there as well, because there is a spillover of the conflicts from across the border. I accepted the job because I wanted to be a part of the peace process. I wanted to have that experience, but I didn't have any crucial information of how the logistics are set up. And I felt that for my own safety, I actually was not ready, to take that step, which is a huge shame, because I actually really wanted the job. I wanted to do this, but then I felt that it wasn't quite right, with the organizations of everything. But then I also realized that working in conflict zones and working in contexts this fragile, that's a part of the deal, that you don't know, that you don't have everything set up in front of you, that sometimes you don't have all of the details. I just felt that it was not enough for me to take that leap. I did have experiences from Kenya and Tanzania, because I actually studied international relations and Swahili. So I studied in a university in Tanzania, in Zanzibar, and at a university in Nairobi. And I got connected with a lot of local people. And because I was also always interested in politics, I did a lot of research on a lot of different aspects on corruption. Through my travels and training my Swahili, I had a conversation with a mother of a couple of children, and she said that she ran away from Garissa because of the Al-Shabaab attack there, and her husband being killed while he was driving a lorry because he was working as a lorry driver, and she escaped to Malindi at the time. And this was my connection to actually moving from being interested in politics to being interested in conflict, crisis, security. This is why I came to Sciences Po, actually. And that's why I wanted to study international security. Even by being in this environment, which was not dangerous at all. It was not a conflict zone. It was Kenya, Tanzania. It was fine at the time. But still, it's a very complex political setting with so many forces at hand that this multidimensionality is so hard to grasp, because there's always so many things that pull a little bit harder depending on the moment or the situation. And when you speak to people from these countries, you'll realize that they have very strong opinions, whether that's tied to a religion, whether that's tied to a political party, or there is a completely different system of political affairs. I worked a lot on electoral violence, for example, how that is used as one of the tools. But on the other hand, I always feel very hesitant to put a judgment on how countries choose to do democracy and how they choose to set their countries. I come from Poland. We don't have a colonial history, but colonial history is a huge part of state building, especially in Africa. And there's those forces against that, right? And we have seen it with France being kicked out of Mali and other places, where we as a society try to work on conflict, but then there is sometimes internal resistance towards it because of the past.
Of course.
Do you have any thoughts on that? It must be so difficult for you also as a French woman to have been working on these contexts.
I've never seen myself as a French woman working on this context, but increasingly I think the political reality in Africa caught up with me. In the Burundi and in the DRC, there was no strong anti-French sentiment, but it was in Rwanda. for sure. And in West Africa, at the time I worked there, I also worked on Anglophone Africa, Sierra Leone and Liberia, and the Mano River, Guinea to an extent. It was not so strong at the time. It was stronger in Ivory Coast or in the Sahel region, but at the time I was in the field, it was not the same. It was not the same as now. But now, I think where you speak from is more important than what you do. I don't know if it's a good or a bad development, but it's definitely the case now. Where I speak from and the perception of where I speak from, which is, from Paris or from France, increasingly mattered. I think today, in 2025, where you speak from as an analyst, as a policy analyst, as an advocate, as even a diplomat, matters a lot more than it used to. It's very, very political now. Where I speak from, France in this case, is definitely something that would be challenged. So it's more difficult, I think, for French people to work on African issues these days than it used to be, because our words, our policy analysis is immediately challenged by this sort of a past colonial framework, colonial past. So the value of what we say is less, I would say.
Despite your experience.
Despite the experience. Of course, I still have a lot of friends and a whole sort of personal network of people, and even people in these countries, but also people in the UN, including high-level African envoys who worked for the AU or for the UN or for international organizations that I've worked a lot with. We have this sort of relationship of mutual esteem. But I wouldn't want to repeat this experience of going to the field like I did in the 90s or in the year 2000 with Crisis Group now, because I think it will not be perceived in the same way. We are also in a different moment of history. We are in definitely a different historical cycle. When I started my career, it was the post-Cold War. And at that time, for at least 15 years, everyone believed that there was more openness in the international system, that there was an opportunity to cooperate, that the states, the big powers could actually reach consensus on peace strategies and reach a common vision on what the problem and the nature of the problem was in some of these conflict zones, and then reach a common understanding of what needs to be done, from peace processes or peace mediation to peacekeeping strategies to peace building strategies, and that there would be more areas of potential consensus between these big powers. And so that therefore, the countries, the parties to conflict would have less sort of room to maneuver. And that's the time when peace mediation, peace negotiation, but also peacekeeping, peace building, sort of industry, it's not a bad word in my mouth, but that's the time where these peace practices sort of exploded. And then a lot of organizations started working on that and developing expertise and trainings. But I think that window of opportunity and that historical cycle has closed now. And it was not easy to accept, frankly, because it was our business to produce this analysis from the field and so on. But I think it's closed. It's closed because the big powers have different strategies, and we see it now with the US, of course with Russia and China, but also now with the US, that they're no longer interested in cooperating, in reaching consensus on some of the peripheral, I would say, issues, including conflicts in various places in the world. Less consensus, more competition, and less consensus also on order in which this conflict resolution strategy would place themselves. What do you do on peace processes? What do you do on peacekeeping? What do you do on peace building? I don't think there is a sort of a framework that everyone agrees to now. And also a pool of resources. Where are the resources to actually put on the ground? A peacekeeping mission is not expensive if you compare it to a US intervention in Afghanistan. It's very, very cheap. Peacekeeping operations have actually learned a lot on fragility. What is fragility in a country? Multidimensional peacekeeping missions have learned a lot. Peace building organizations have learned a lot about fragility and what it means to work in DRC or Afghanistan or Haiti or South Sudan. But they are less acceptable now than they used to be. So I think one of the big changes that I see in this field is precisely that it's very difficult to find consensus on what to do. And then the question is, who does what? Now you've seen, a bunch of new mediators come into the equation. Turkey wants to do mediation. Qatar wants to do mediation. Even Saudi Arabia wants to get involved in global governance now. China wants to try to reconcile Iran and Saudi Arabia. Everyone wants to do mediation, but it's outside of the sort of traditional framework and context that we knew. So my hope is that these new actors will also learn the same lessons that we've learned in the last 30 years or so, that it's very difficult to fix situations in fragile countries. It's very difficult to actually create peace processes that are effective in situations like that. And just making deals doesn't fix fragility. So I hope that they will learn the lessons. I think they have started learning lessons already about reliability of some of the solutions that they propose, reliability of some of the partners. They're starting to read interests of the parties to conflicts in a different way. But we are not there yet. We are not there yet. For sure, the international liberal order is not necessarily acceptable to all these days. And so a lot of the practice on conflict resolution has to be examined again. The political foundations of this practice is definitely shaken. So that's one of the reasons I think that we see a resurgence of conflicts in the last few years. More violence, more displacement, more humanitarian needs. I mean, Sudan and South Sudan actually are a disaster from a humanitarian standpoint. There are millions and millions and millions of people displaced. They are starving. It's a shame.
While I have been waiting for our interview, I actually went through my notes from our class and realized how what we have been studying and talking about in 2018 all been about the structures and about everything that has been set up. But now we have a very different world situation between 2021 and 2023. I worked at the OECD's conflict crisis and fragility team. So fragility, multidimensional fragility, the connections between conflict and fragility, it has been a huge development. And yet, since that time, every single year, there is less and less money put into fragility, into fragile context, despite the fact that this is where the biggest gaps in terms of achieving the SDGs are. So it is true that now there is this fear of what's going to happen, but a lot of people also want to redefine what we have been doing wrong as the development assistance community within the OECD, and how to leverage the new architecture that is not yet there. How can we create it, as you have said, in a way that there are some lessons that are being learned?
Peace building is, I would say, the orphan of the big geopolitical changes that we're seeing right now. We've seen a shift for the last few years about that. Peace building, conflict prevention, and so on are not as funded as they used to be. And we've seen a number of big governments that were very committed to that, for example, Sweden, Scandinavian countries, that really pushed this work very, very much and very far, actually. These governments have changed priorities. And it's, to an extent, I would say, understandable because of the Russian threat. We've seen that since 2022, of course, since the Russians invaded Ukraine, a lot of the northern countries in Europe and also eastern countries in Europe have basically said to Western Europe, we told you that this was going to happen. And so it's totally understandable that priorities are changing. But the work that was done was very important and very interesting, and nobody seems to be interested in pursuing it anymore. So a lot of money now is going to defense spending. Clearly, the priorities have changed. Also, now we see with development aid and humanitarian aid, the USAID freeze by the Trump government, but also the cuts that we see in the French, in the UK, in the Dutch, in the Belgian development, and the Swedish development aid budget shows that it's a trend. Yesterday, I was listening to the new Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, who was saying that we're going to be retrenching from some of our humanitarian programs. We are still faithful to our principles, and we're going to rely more on people locally to actually deliver this aid and so on. But there will be cuts, and that means that a lot of people will die. The withdrawal from the global health programs from the US is a disaster, because a lot of people who were getting treatments and medicines paid by the US government are no longer going to get them. So of course people are going to die. The SDG agenda that everyone was so committed to is going to be set back.
It has been.
This whole agenda is going to be set back.
Something that we did at the OECD, which for anyone interested, there is the new States of Fragility report that has been launched around a month ago. And what we have done is that we have measured the progress of fragile context specifically against the SDGs.
Mm-hmm.
And already last time there has been so many records and the highest amount of active conflicts, and it's scary to see that and to see that there will be more and more of that because there is less and less money that is put into it.
I think the old world is no longer, and so there will be less resources and there will be a need to rethink, reimagine, reinvent humanitarian aid, development aid, and conflict prevention, conflict resolution strategies. It's probably an opportunity to do some reforms because this world also had flaws. Nothing was perfect, but there will be less resources. There will be less resources. So it's probably an opportunity for local leadership, resilience strategies at a local or national level. But it's a wake-up call that not everybody is hearing at the same pace, at the same time, and in the same way. I don't know who is hearing this wake-up call that this old world of having more resources to do these things, solidarity, thinking is going to change. And policies are going to be more selfish, are going to be more nationalistic. Maybe it's an opportunity for local leadership, but for us, international and the citizens of the world, it's a big change. We should have listened to the signs. It's been, I think, the last maybe 15 years have been like a sort of series, There was a series of signs on the wall from the Iraq war in 2003 to the financial crisis in 2007, 2008 to the Arab Springs and particularly the Libya intervention in 2011. There were quite a number of international events that have actually accentuated the fracture, the fragmentation and the loss of trust in some of the big principles that we preach as the international community, quote unquote. Russians have said from 2007 very clearly that they intended to be more forceful in protecting their sphere of influence or regaining influence over former sphere of influence with the Georgia war in 2008, then the Crimea in 2014, and then again Ukraine 2022, Syria also, the help to the Syrian government in 2014, 15. We should have, I think, realized in the last 10, 15 years that the world was changing. But the work I used to do, particularly when I was with Crisis Group and then with the UN, the work on prevention, the policy analysis, the policy prescriptions, the high-level advocacy, the peacekeeping work, the peace-building work, all of this needs to be reimagined.
If you've ever dreamt of working at the UN, EU, or NGOs, you already know. It's not easy. The competition is fierce, the job market is complex, and the recruitment process? Let's just say it's not always as fair and transparent as we'd like to believe. I know this because I've been there. I spent years trying to break into international organizations, facing rejections after rejections until I finally cracked the code. I worked at the UN, EU, and the OECD, and along the way, I realized something. The biggest reason so many talented people struggle isn't because they are not qualified. It's because they don't know the rules of the game. That's why I created IO Ready, International Organizations Ready, and the career coaching program for IOs and NGOs designed to give you the insider knowledge, strategies, and confidence to land your dream job in international organizations. It's a step-by-step roadmap tailored specifically to IOs and NGOs. And here is a secret most people don't realize. Getting in isn't just about qualifications. It's about strategy. I'll show you how to think like a recruiter, position yourself as the ideal candidate, and navigate the process with confidence. So if you're serious about working in international organizations, stop guessing and start strategizing. Visit www.io-ready.com to sign up now. Spots are limited, so don't wait.
You have held a lot of leadership positions across the different organizations that you have worked in. How did you get there? You had this initial leadership experience when you were working in the Great Lakes region. And then how did you bring that to some of the other organizations? Because you very quickly became the director for this, the director for that, the deputy director for that. How did you do that?
Well, I think I got lucky, first of all, because I worked with great people. Every time it was a sort of collective adventure, I worked with other colleagues in the organizations, and we were a few people, small teams, creating strategies and creating new programs. So I was not always on my own. But I think one of the key to the success, I would say, of my career, because I consider that I've had a very fulfilling life and career, one of the keys to this is the desire to contribute, the desire to say something, to produce good papers, and to say something that makes sense, that is useful. Sometimes I would think and rethink a lot, think over my own thinking, rethink the policy recommendations. I would reread my notes 15 times, think and think and think and think. It's a lot of thinking and verifications and checking, and go back to people and say, did you really say this? And try to find ways of saying the right thing that is not harmful to people, that is right and relevant and timely, and that would actually trigger the right response. So a lot of work into this, the desire to not just to be exact or to be focused and relevant, but also the desire to contribute to something, always to look for the right entry point and the right answer, and explore different ways of having an impact. So that's the reason why also I went from one organization to the other. I stayed with Crisis Group for 11 years, which is a long time commitment. But after that, I decided to work for the UN because I wanted to work for an intergovernmental organization that has different type of power and different type of impact. And it was absolutely fascinating experience. I went to Sudan. It was in the middle of the difficult negotiation over Darfur, and I learned so much. From the way the UN works, and also from the experience in Sudan. It was absolutely horrible and fascinating at the same time. And then I moved to New York, where I worked not for the UN, but around the UN. I was the representative of Crisis Group in New York, and I worked on the issues on the Security Council agenda, so looking at how the negotiations in the multilateral context with 193 missions based in New York was happening. And that also taught me a lot, because actually have very, very political negotiations through a Security Council resolution sort of amendment process. When the text shuttles from one mission to the other, it's actually real diplomacy. So you learn a lot about diplomacy too. And then I decided to work also for the big philanthropies, because it's also a different sort of mentality, culture, but they're very demanding in terms of impact. The Gates Foundation, wow, when you put in a grant application and you have to report on your grant, there are so many criteria about impact that you have to think through. It's interesting for this reason also to look at how they think about impact. They have that sort of the private sector culture in a way. But in the UN, what was interesting was the diplomatic process. How do you get to a consensus, for example, on the mandate of a peacekeeping mission? How does the peacekeeping mission monitor the implementation of a peace agreement? How does the peacekeeping mission support the deployment into a force and the support strategy to a government in the making? That was the case of South Sudan. Does the UN mission get to a consensus to support a referendum on self-determination? The UN was interesting for that reason. In Crisis Group, what was interesting was the spark. How do you get the idea by doing so much research, by talking to so many people? How do you actually produce a strategy? And just an anecdote, when I was working on Burundi as a Crisis Group analyst, I worked a lot on the peace process. At one point, it was Mandela who was the mediator. And I wrote a paper called the Mandela Effect that sort of brought together all the pieces of information, lots of little bits of information and big pieces of information I had from the mediation team, from the various delegations to the peace talks. So it was like a big synthesis of everything. So these are the key questions, and this is what the solution will look like in a potential peace agreement. And the Arusha agreement ended up taking some of
from your paper.
Not so much taking from the paper, but it was just very aligned with what I had picked up. So some of the people in Burundi would tell me afterwards, how did you do this? Do you have magical powers? Because the peace agreement had sort of summarized some of the same issues that were in my paper. And it was just because I listened to people. It was not that I had any magical powers. It was just the power of listening and of taking in, all this information and talking to all these different parties, from the radical Hutu side and the radical Tutsi side and the middle parties or the more moderate parties. I really talked to everybody. And so I was able to, like the mediators, get a lot of information into one paper. But it was funny to experience this moment. All these people in Bujumbura was telling me, wow, how did you do this? Do you have insider information? I said, no, I just thought about it, and put all the pieces of the puzzle together. I was happy to be able to be useful, right, to them.
So coming back to the question of leadership, you would say that it's about providing value in a strategic way, also experiencing the different ways in which you can have impact, because what you have described from moving from different types of organizations, international NGOs, philanthropies, working for think tanks, you can have impact in many different ways, and you learn along the way to then have more impact in your next and next position. This is something that when I work through my career coaching program one-on-one with clients, this is what I always tell them, because there's a lot of young people that say, I want to work for the UN. I always say that the value that you bring to the UN at a certain stage of your career comes from all that, from being in the field, from being in a national office, from being in the headquarters, and to be putting all of those experiences together.
Yes, absolutely. I enjoyed all the experiences. I've enjoyed everything because all these actors try to contribute and have an impact, right? And they are all complementary to each other. So it's not like there's one type of actor that is better than another, right? But the sort of track one diplomacy is complemented by what NGO do, because some of the stuff we used to do in crisis group, for example, or in other think tanks would actually go through to the top level, right? And then you get some of the NGOs brief the Security Council because they have interesting information to share. And the big philanthropies, they complement the work of states, right? Because they bring resources to programs and to supporting also civil society or some governments. They complement development aid national policies. So they all have a role to play. I think, however, that in the world we are in right now, everyone has to question their ways of working. I don't think we can do business as usual anymore. A lot of what I've said applied to the last 25 years, but I don't know if it will apply to the next 25 years. I'm not sure about that. I think there will be think tanks, and hopefully there will be think tanks everywhere, in India, in Brazil, in Saudi Arabia, and in a lot of African countries. There are already think tanks. Hopefully their voice will be stronger. Same with civil society organizations in general. And the soft power, of these organizations will be strengthened, amplified by the power of the government they are in. If the emerging countries, for example, of the so-called Global South have a stronger voice, then some of the organizations working there will also have a stronger voice, and maybe the debate will change, will be influenced by that, and that's a good thing. The question is, how do you get to consensus? It's great that there's a diversity of point of view. It makes the solutions probably more legitimate and more impactful, more interesting, but you can't have 15 different sort of voices without a framework or a place to actually discuss the diverse views, to actually have an impact on the ground in the conflict zone. You need to find a way to reach consensus on the kind of strategies that need to be put in place. So where is it that we can find this consensus? And right now, it might not be the Security Council, or it would be the Security Council plus. So where is it that we can actually all talk to each other? That the Chinese will bring their views of peace in Afghanistan, and the Indians, and also the US, and also the Europeans, and whoever has a voice and an impact on the ground. There needs to be a place or places where consensus can be formed. Otherwise, the parties to the conflict will just go forum shopping, and they will never feel the pressure to end the conflict.
It's really interesting for me to have been a part of the conflict analysis community while the war in Ukraine started. I come from Poland. Again, we have a very strong connection to the Soviet Union and the trauma that comes with that. And it was interesting to see how before the conflict, Poland had very little political power, and how that has completely changed the position of my country in the whole conflict conversation. So it definitely is possible. There's so many more actors now. Eastern Europe hasn't been well understood, and I could see that within the community that I was working in as well. There were some intricacies that I understand about the communities and about how grievances have been formed, how that has been preserved for so many decades now. But it was really interesting to be in this moment of history, to see that suddenly my country is a leader of something, because they haven't been. On the other hand, I wanted to talk about something personal because for me, the war has had a very negative effect on my mental health and on my work and on my connection to actually working on conflict analysis. It was very hard for me. I was one of those people that were very hopeful that the war will not happen. So then when it did, and my family has, 5 evacuation plans as of right now because everyone is preparing for what could potentially come, it became, for my mental health, very, very difficult to work on conflict analysis because suddenly from that intellectual curiosity that you spoke about, that I had about countries that were very far away from where I come from, to be seeing and experiencing the changes on the ground in Eastern Poland, but also obviously in Ukraine so much more. So many of my friends have been affected by that. How did you deal with the process of your mental health changes? Because I bet that from the very beginning, you needed to face a lot of things as a young woman that you wouldn't have had if you didn't work in conflict zones. What you have mentioned about your intern being killed in Afghanistan, I mean, that must have been traumatizing for you as well. How do you deal with that? And how do you still have this grit to keep going and keep changing the things? Or maybe this is because of that.
It's quite overwhelming sometimes to work on violence, to think about the mechanisms that were triggered by the genocide propaganda in Rwanda, for example. Also to lose friends, because in Burundi I actually lost a lot of friends. Friends who were just like you and me, like educated people, but just didn't have the money necessarily to get a medical treatment, or people who just were in the wrong place in the wrong time. It's tough. And I think for me, what made the biggest difference was to be able to be associated with peace processes that actually led to a result. And the Burundi peace process led to a result. It was first with Tanzania, with Mwalimu Nyerere as the mediator, and then with Mandela as a mediator. It was a very long peace process with a lot of different stages, right? So there were very big framework agreement, was the Arusha agreement. And then there was a ceasefire with some of the rebel groups. And then there was an agreement on the rotating political transition with power sharing between the various parties. And then there was another piece to it, which is the last rebel groups that had to join basically the political life in Burundi. So it was a very long process and the war was very long, but it got to something. It got somewhere. It was transformative to an extent. And it was transformative because for lots of different reasons, which we don't have time to detail here, but it was transformative, I think, because people coming together, people started realizing that over time, and it took a long time again, but they started realizing that both sides had blood on their hands and that both sides had victims as well. And so that if they wanted to get to power, they had to share it for a certain period of time. I think Mandela in particular helped demystifize the ethnic side of it. So there was a lot of accusations on all sides, but there was a taboo about talking about ethnicity. It was a taboo in Burundi, and that taboo broke at one point. And I've seen myself people change over time. People who actually would go to these peace talks and listen to the other sides after couple of years, they were like, okay, I hear you. And it was really moving. These moments were very moving, particularly one military officer who was quite high up in the ranks of the army, who told me one day, now I understand. When I was younger, I was scared. There was so much fear in the army. We were scared of the other side, and maybe we gave the wrong orders, maybe we did the wrong things. But now I understand. The mechanisms that were at play. I understand what happened. I understand that they were scared of us too, right? I regret some of the things I've done, and I'm ready to face justice. And the day this person told me this, I thought to myself, okay, this made not just my day, but this made my last few years. Now I understand why I'm doing this work, because people change over time. They realize that some of the things that they believed in were no longer true, or just the dynamics of the conflict change, but people change at the individual level. So that was quite transformative for the country. That was transformative for me. I'm not saying that the situation is perfect in Burundi now. It's not. It's definitely not. There were many flaws in the agreement and that were not really addressed afterwards, not in particular the economy. I think the economy is still not where it should be. But the main violence stopped. And so I think that saved me, really. That saved my mental health. And that saved my faith in this work, because it actually meant something and it got somewhere and it was successful and mediation worked. and it was African mediation in African context. It worked. Right now, if you look around in conflict situations, the last peace process we had was Colombia. And Colombia worked, and it's a very interesting peace agreement and a very interesting peace process to actually analyze also. But it's 2016, and we haven't had any successful peace process since, So I was fortunate to be able to work on processes that led somewhere.
So you basically channeled the mental health challenges and the challenges that came from the job to focusing even more on making a difference and for making the peace
You learn,
stay.
you learn a lot of lessons. You start with a lot of idealism, and then you learn a lot of lessons, because the reality of these places is very complex, as I said before. One person cannot fix it, obviously, and it's for the local parties to a conflict to fix their own situation. But you learn what you can or cannot do. You learn what's useful at what time. You learn about opportunities to make a difference, to push little things at certain times. You learn diplomacy, what works at the diplomatic level or not. In crisis group, I had an interesting boss at one time who was a former foreign minister, and he said to us, to the team, look, foreign ministers are not particularly evil, but they have a pile of dossiers on their desk every day, 10 urgencies to address. So if you send them a report of 50 pages with 200 policy recommendations, they will not read it, I can guarantee it. But if you frame your top 3 policy recommendations in a certain way, if you use the right language, the right keywords, you write short executive summaries and things that are easily actionable, digestible, and so on, maybe their cabinet and themselves, they will pay attention. So there are certain ways also of expressing yourself that you learn.
Depending on the audience that you're targeting.
So you learn about leverage. You learn about what actually makes the difference, how to reach the right people. You learn also how to analyze the sort of the power map.
Yes, that's very important.
Who is in the chain of command in a specific movement, in a specific political party, in a specific government? Who is in the chain? Who actually has leverage on X, Y, and Z situation? So it's a lot of learning. You have to learn. That's called experience. You have to learn how to read the forces in the room and so on. So it's a lot. I've learned a lot. And this is what kept me going, I think. It's just learning more how to make a difference in specific situations. So you never give up. But it's true that the world is changing, and it's tough to adapt to change. It's tough. Everything I've learned, does it apply to today's world? Does it not? Do I have to keep learning? How to adapt, how to adjust.
And it's probably one of the key elements of your job right now, right?
Yeah. So we are at the Paris Peace Forum. We are trying something else. It's a new experiment on global governance. Multi-actor, not just states, but also civil society organizations, businesses.
Projects.
Ideas, projects, policy initiatives. We sort of try to capture, to identify the new ideas, to identify the needs in global governance, and to try to do something about it. So it's an action-oriented type of diplomacy. It's a new diplomacy that is not just based on state diplomacy, but more inclusive, more networked, more multi-actor, we call it. And it's interesting. It's interesting because there are lots of good ideas out there. Lots of people who want to make a difference, and you just have to find them and bring them together. And that's what we do. We try to convene all the coalitions of the willing.
I actually have a personal connection to the Paris Peace Forum because in the first edition, so in 2018, I worked as an assistant to the Kenyan delegation to the president, Uhuru Kenyatta, at the time. And it was transformative for me because I was in my first year of my studies and I got to straight away be among the 78 presidents at that first edition of it. Putin was there, which was very stressful for me being Polish. It was a really amazing initiative. And since then, I loved it so much. I always talk about it. It's one of my favorite events in the year. But you have also changed how it has been organized, because at the very beginning, it was available for everyone to register under some conditions, but now it's by invitation only. So it has changed how you put it together now.
Yes, the methodology has changed a little bit, but it's also because of the success. The success was such that it was just a bit overwhelming in terms of numbers. Paris is an old city with a lot of beautiful buildings, but the buildings are not always very, very big. And so we had to basically adjust our invitation policy also to the places that we organize. The Paris Peace Forum it has become a really interesting event, I have to say, with sessions of very high quality. The dialogues on specific issues are really high quality, And it's a place where a lot of different communities can meet. And so that's also how diplomacy is made these days, right?
Yes.
And so it's interesting to bring all these communities together. For example, in the technology field, you cannot do anything without the big companies. Right?
Absolutely.
They are almost as powerful or more powerful than states. So they definitely have to be at the discussion table. We are a place where we can actually bring all of these new actors. It's another experiment, ways to influence international diplomacy that's very fruitful. And I think it has an impact, it has results, and it's action oriented, which I like. And maybe that's the conclusion of our interview. It's like, I like action.
We'll make it a main quote. I like action.
I like engagement, right? I like to be engaged.
What's one book or resource that has shaped your approach to leadership or diplomacy?
The books I liked are literature books, not necessarily political books.
But that has a lot of stories and storytelling and inspiration in it as well.
I always liked the 19th century books, the French 19th century books, Stendhal or Flaubert. I always liked this, probably is the first literary love that I had. So I was always inspired by literature more than anything else.
Interesting. And that's why you studied literature as well.
Yeah.
How do you maintain a work-life balance? That's a very relevant question. I'm so curious how you get to do all this, move from country to country, and still have friends, have time to do your hobbies.
When you're in the field, you make a lot of friends because people are in the same situation as you are. So it's very easy to bond. So there's always a community of people that you can have a social life with. And it's fun sometimes. But of course, working on conflicts is very consuming and you travel a lot and so on. So it could be disruptive to personal life. So I shifted personally between Africa and New York. And New York, you can have a different type of life. I think it's important not to be in the field forever or to, as I did, do like a shuttle in between European capitals or New York and conflict zones. But it takes time to adjust. I remember the first time I came back from Burundi, I went to the supermarket and there were so many brands of yogurts.
Yes.
And, desserts and stuff. And I was like stunned. And I stood there for like a half an hour looking at the variety of products and not knowing which one to pick. So it's difficult to readjust every time. It's been difficult every time, but I think it's important. And then at some point, especially for women, you have to decide whether you want children or not. And if you want children, then, there are some decisions to be made about that because it's very difficult to have a child and to raise a child in a war zone. At some point, you have to make that decision and not too late if possible, because I know a lot of people who ended up in their 40s thinking, I loved my career, but what about family life? And sometimes it's a bit difficult to take that sort of curve. So career is really important. Commitment is really important. The life experience is really important. But then at some point, in your 30s or mid-30s, you have to think about the future and whether you want it or not. And that's important to remember, especially for women.
A lot of people think about it now because people started speaking up about it. And before, no one was talking about it. So you didn't know what was the risk that you were taking. Not knowingly, of course, because you focus so much on your career and you don't think about what's ahead.
It's a very fulfilling life and career, but having children is also very fulfilling. So if that's something you desire, not everybody does, but if that's something you desire, you have to make space in your life. And conflict work takes up all the space, a lot of the space. It's really fantastic to contribute. It's fantastic to have an impact and you make a lot of friends and, it's a fantastic experience, but it takes a lot of space in your personal life. If you want to have a family life, you have to recreate that space and it takes a little bit of time. You shouldn't miss that crossroad, because you might regret it afterwards. So that's my advice to especially young women. Sometimes you can do both. There are places where you can totally be in the field and raise your children, schools and everything you need there. But conflict zones, this is not the case in conflict zones.
What's your go-to hobby or activity that helps you recharge?
Exercise, of course, yoga or else, and reading. Yeah.
It helps you escape from the real world, especially the 19th century novels, no?
Yeah, well, reading when you manage to have enough sort of mental focus.
Looking back at your journey, is there a specific moment or decision that completely changed the trajectory of your career?
I think the German experience that I mentioned in the beginning was really important for me, because then I realized how interested I was in politics and also, of course, having children. So that's a decision that I made, and that also meant that I couldn't go back to the Sahel or Sudan. I would have done otherwise.
If you could have a conversation with your younger self, just starting out in the field, what advice would you give?
That's an interesting question. I don't regret anything. I think I would redo again what I did. I don't have any regrets. A friend of mine once told me something that I always remember. He said, you have to start living a little at one point, so live and experience, and don't be afraid. Just be aware of the risks, but don't be afraid of living your life fully and learn from it. So keep learning, keep experimenting.
Who would you like to see next on our Diplomatic Changemakers Off the Record podcast?
There's the former foreign minister of Ukraine who's now teaching at Sciences Po, Dmitry Kuleba.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. And what question would you like to ask him? Just one.
How does it feel to see your country go into war?
That's a heavy question.
And have you always known that Russia would go back to war? Have you always known that the situation of Ukraine was unstable and that it would be challenged at some point?
Well, thank you so much for
Thank
taking
you.
part in this episode. I hope you enjoyed the question and had an opportunity to think about your rich career and all of the adventures that you have had. And thank you for sharing it with our Are You Ready community and a lot of people who are as ambitious as you were to change the world and make it a better place.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Changemakers Off the Record. I'm Wiola and I hope that today's conversation left you inspired and informed about the realities of international diplomacy. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with fellow changemakers. Remember, stay bold, stay diplomatic, and keep changing the world, both on and off the record.